Do you feel that Apple is somehow gouging or doing something wrong?
Yes, of course.
Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers was caught off guard during an interview with Jon Stewart, and I got the clip. So this was over a discussion on inflation. Before I get to Summers' view on inflation and then a couple of clips from this interview, Summers, of course, worked under Reagan, under Bill Clinton, under Barack Obama, supported every bank bailout, is generally very conservative, and takes the standard approach to inflation that most people in his space do, that to combat inflation, people must be put out of work. That's what these people think. So I'll get to the variable that Jon Stewart brought up, and it's one that is never discussed by these individuals. But on the point of how Summers feels about all this, so he thinks massive unemployment is needed to beat inflation. This is an article from July of last year. So economists will generally tell you that when the unemployment rate falls, the inflation rate rises because workers have the power to bargain for higher wages, which then gets passed on to consumers. When the unemployment rate rises, inflation should drop since workers have less leverage in a weak labor market. So this is the perspective that someone like Summers comes from. And he got more specific about just how much pain he thought it would take. Quote, "We need 5 years of unemployment above 5% to contain inflation. In other words, we need 2 years of 7.5% unemployment, or 5 years of 6% unemployment, or 1 year of 10% unemployment," Summers said during a speech at the London School of Economics. He added that the numbers were remarkably discouraging compared with the predictions of Federal Reserve leaders who have suggested they can bring down inflation without pushing unemployment much above 4%. So there is a very important variable here that is never discussed by these people, and Jon Stewart brings it up here, and Larry Summers tries to turn the tables on him, and it does not work.
The tools that we have, though, are basically saying to somebody, everyone's paying more for gas and groceries, and that's really hard. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to throw 10 million of them out of work so that we all don't have to share that burden. Why aren't we attacking corporate profit in any way? Because that's been estimated to be 30% of inflation, 40% of inflation.
I don't think it's a tenable view that all of a sudden corporations became greedy. Of course, there's monopolies in the economy, John, and we should be for
They've been
much
bragging
more
about
aggressive,
it on
much more aggressive
earnings calls.
than we were.
They're on their earnings calls, they're saying our profits have never been higher. We're killing it. The markups during the pandemic are sometimes they're saying 70% of what they were.
If there was a huge increase in the demand for shrewd television commentary, I imagine the demand for what you do would go way up. And I imagine you'd convert that into higher wages and getting more and getting paid better.
You're saying it's the market at work.
I don't think you'd call yourself a gouger when you.
I would absolutely call myself a gouger.
When you did that.
And by the way, the effect of the talk show business is very different than the effect of ExxonMobil, right? I mean, let's be fair.
Isn't this show going to be on Apple TV?
Correct.
And I think Apple TV is worth about 5 times as much as Exxon. I think Apple's price, since the stimulus began, Apple's value has gone up by about $1.2 trillion.
Right.
That's $4,000 for every American, just in increase in the value of Apple.
You just made my point for me.
Do you feel that Apple is somehow gouging or doing something wrong?
Yes, of course. And Exxon is, and Mobil is.
All right, I'm going to get to the rest of that clip in a second here, but I had to pause there because that moment is so perfect. Larry Summers pretends he's just randomly bringing up Apple, yet he has all these figures ready. Oh, their value went up by 1.2 trillion. He knew exactly what he was doing. He came prepared. He knew Jon Stewart was going to talk about corporate profits. So his idea was, oh, I'll get him back because he's on Apple TV. I'm going to bring up Apple's profits. And Jon Stewart's like, yeah, they should not be making that much money. It's like, because Jon Stewart's critique is a principled one, as opposed to Larry Summers, who simply cares about himself and his buddies. This is the idea that the only way to combat inflation is by putting more people out of work. And yes, it's roughly 10 million that Larry Summers is arguing. 10 million people should be put out of work to combat inflation. How is that not just laughed out of the room on its face? When you have massive, record high corporate profits going on. So corporate profits have hit a record high. This is an article from late last year, amid a 40-year high inflation. So profits in the non-financial sector hit a record high of $2.08 trillion in the third quarter, even as 40-year high inflation continues to squeeze American consumers. And I have more on this. By the way, this is also happening in Canada. So just an example of how this is affecting other countries as well. And from the Economic Policy Institute here, corporate profits have contributed disproportionately to inflation. So to show you that here, and I'm going to read off the blurb that EPI put with this figure here, writing, since the trough of the COVID-19 recession in the second quarter of 2020, overall prices in the non-financial sector have risen at an annualized rate of 6.1%, a pronounced acceleration over the 1.8% price growth that characterized the pre-pandemic business cycle of 2007 to 2019. Strikingly, over half of this increase, 53.9%, can be attributed to fatter profit margins, with labor costs contributing less than 8% of this increase. This is not normal. From 1979 to 2019, profits only contributed about 11% to price growth and labor costs over 60%, as shown in Figure A below. Non-labor inputs, a decent indicator for supply chain snarls, are also driving up prices more than usual in the current economic recovery. So when you see corporate profits up like this, how do you not, if you're honest with yourself, if Larry Summers is honest with himself, how does he not acknowledge that this is clearly part of the problem? But no, his view is one that must always benefit those at the top of massive corporations. So let me get to the rest of this clip.
Let's talk about Apple. Let's talk about Apple. Do you think Apple should just sell phones for less and not have enough phones? What would you have Apple do?
You're saying to me, John, market forces are market forces. And if demand goes up, are you suggesting, young man, that Apple should charge less than they could charge? Let me flip that on you. When there's a tightness in the labor market, what you're saying is the workers shouldn't do the same. That the workers, just following the same capitalistic principles that allow Apple to charge more for their phones, shouldn't charge more because wage inflation is driving inflation.
That's not at all what I'm saying, John.
That's exactly what you're saying.
Actually, it isn't. Every worker should get as high a wage as they can. It would be a terrible idea.
But the Fed is going to intervene. The Fed is going to intervene to make that not possible.
No, the Fed is intervening to control the overall level of demand growth.
And what will that do to the labor market?
Much faster.
What will that do to the labor market? What will it do to the labor market? It will loosen it.
Likely to lead to
looser labor markets.
A somewhat looser labor market.
Exactly.
We hope to minimize that consequence.
It's hard to argue that this is anything but sociopathic. That you have people not making nearly enough. You are kind of acknowledging that here in your discussion, saying, oh, yeah, workers should make as much as they can. But they're not making as much as they can. Wages are incredibly low when we're looking at, forget before inflation. Just the cost of housing, the cost of groceries, before any of this happened the past couple of years, was already out of whack. It's even more out of whack now. Workers have been able to raise their pay a little bit, but nowhere near. It has not kept up with inflation. Even places like CNN acknowledge that. Wages continue to rise. They still are not keeping pace with inflation. So all this is going on, yet your solution is to ensure workers have less power. Put more people, 10 million people out of work. I don't even understand how Larry Summers is taken seriously. It really just appears to be a case of, hey, he's worked with powerful people, so he must know what he's talking about, as opposed to analyzing what their ideology, what someone like Summers is actually arguing for, and what clearly is not being explored in the case of massive corporate profits and how that can be controlled. But last thing to end on here, just when it comes to the pace of annual pay increases, the top 1% wage grew 138% since 1979, while wages for the bottom 90% grew 15%. So this goes to 2013. Wages, of course, have increased a little bit since then, but nowhere near what you're seeing the top 1% make. Yet somehow that does not need to be addressed at all. Leave those people alone. Let them take all the wealth while the rest of society gets starved. It is ridiculous on its face, and I'm glad Jon Stewart was able to show how much of a clown Larry Summers is.